Welcome to Podcasting Smarter, the podcast for podcasters by podcasters. Podcasting Smarter is the official podcast from Podbean, featuring podcasting interviews, best practices, and helpful tips. We're here to give you the tools, resources, product updates, and news to help you get started podcasting and keep your podcast growing.
Hello and welcome to Podcasting Smarter. This is Norma Jean Belenke, Podbean's head of events. And today's episode is a conversation with CEO and founder Jeff Umbro and Vice President of Marketing and Audience Development, Joni Deutch of the Podglomerate, where we'll get into audience development, monetizing your audience, launch strategy, and more. Stay tuned, and here we go. Hi guys, how's it going?
Hello, hey. Good.
How are you?
Good. We are so excited to talk to you today. So first off, tell us a little bit about what is the Podglomerate?
Sure. So the Podglomerate is a company that I founded back in 2016. And today we do three things. We produce, distribute, and monetize podcasts. So on the production front, we will do white label production as well as owned and operated IP. We just launched our first truly original show called Missing Pages a few months back. It's been doing great. You should check it out. But then we also produce shows for folks like Lifetime, History Channel, A&E, Spotify, etc. We run audience growth campaigns for third parties focused on publicity, marketing, cross-promotion, paid acquisition, pitching the apps, etc. And I'm sure we'll get into a little bit of that later on. And we do that for quite a few organizations across the industry. And then we also run ad sales initiatives for about 70 different shows, agency, direct, programmatic, etc. So we like to think of ourselves as kind of like a services agency that you can come and hire really for any level of podcaster. It can be, somebody who's just doing this as a hobby, or it can be a big Fortune 500 organization. We can kind of help you all level up what you're working on as kind of an independent for-hire agency, as opposed to working with an iHeart, a Sirius, a Spotify, etc.
Amazing. And before we jump into audience development and growth, which is what I want to focus on today, tell us a little bit about how you both got into podcasting, because everybody's journey is so different in the industry.
Yeah, sure. So for me, I actually did not begin my professional career thinking that I would get into podcasting. I was actually pre-medicine, biology, going to be a physician, going to be a doctor, a very different path. And that was about 10, 11 years ago when I was in college. But I always had a love of media. I always had a love of storytelling. I had a love of podcasts, but back then my podcasts were like the KCRW music podcast, like the public radio, tiny desk kind of podcast for music discovery. And I wanted to do something for fun on the side to get me out of the biology lab with rats that, we were doing research on. And so I picked up a shift at the college radio station on campus. And I then eventually decided that I really loved broadcasting. I loved media. I loved, audio and sound storytelling to a higher degree than I thought, and made that my career. So what led me specifically to podcasting, though, around that time was when starting that media journey, I moved to an NPR station to work for my first job, official, post-grad job. And they had a podcast that was pre-existing. It had been around for quite some time. And their approach to podcasting was take the broadcast of it, put it into a podcast feed. And it was about nearly 3 hours per episode.
Wow.
And me coming in, I thought, that doesn't sound like that's a great listener experience. And also, there's never been marketing devoted to this. Let's try to figure out how we can make this a good podcast experience for all involved. So really, that was my first foray into podcasting, was working on that huge, widely listened NPR program that was in a podcast feed, and how we could innovate it and bring it back to life given modern podcast standards. And that's how my career began in public radio and NPR, now with the Podglomerate.
Amazing. And I just kind of want to ask a quick follow-up question. So for everybody out there who is a podcaster that doesn't come from a radio background, what do podcasters need to know, or what can they learn from the folks that come over from public radio, or who studied radio, or even just picked up a shift at the college radio station?
I mean, I would say if you're curious about it, then ask questions. It's getting connected. Media landscape, podcast, public radio landscape, are so kind. I'm not going to say everyone is, but for the most part, everyone I've met on my professional journey, most people on my professional journey have been open, welcoming folks who are, kind enough to be able to give their time, whether a few minutes or over coffee or over email, to be able to give guidance, to give some ideas. So I would just say that if you are even interested in moving into a new career path, if you're being led by passion, then I would encourage you to just ask those questions, put yourself out there, make moves, even if maybe you're not really sure what the charted path is for you yet. You can chart it yourself. There's no one linear way to have a career in media or getting into media. Just know that zigzags can occur, and that's perfectly okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
I couldn't agree more with that. I think it's a lot about just showing the initiative and the effort. I know everybody has different circumstances that they're coming from, but if it's something that you really want, like sometimes you just ask questions and you work towards it, and it's usually a pretty open field for most people to kind of make their way into it. Yeah, and in terms of kind of where Joni's coming from, her and I have different paths but similar experiences where the initial foray into audio came from just being bored at work and looking for like a creative outlet. For Joni, it was in school. For me, it was at an old book publicity job that I had. So I started a podcast where I would interview authors, and I just fell in love with the medium and couldn't stop reading about it and spent all my time like trying to learn more about it. And eventually that led me to, in a roundabout way, creating the Podglomerate.
Amazing. And I think also I've heard you speak about how, that initial book publicity really kind of gave you the foundation for podcast audience growth and publicity as well. So tell us a little bit about what does audience development include and mean these days in terms of podcasting for the average podcast?
Yeah, absolutely. So audience development in podcasting it can be a lot of different things for a lot of people. Like step one is honestly just figuring out what is your goal and what are you trying to do? Are you interested in downloads so that you can monetize them? Are you interested in engaged listeners so that you can build a community around a certain topic? Are you interested in thought leadership, business development, lead generation, building events, premium subscribers, etc.? And there's a little bit of a different strategy that kind of leads into each of those different opportunities. But generally speaking, the key is first figuring that out and then, honing your methods in order to attract like the listeners that you're looking for. We've worked with a lot of folks over the years that are interested in any number of the things that I just mentioned. But generally speaking, you're going to look at some form of, publicity. So, trying to get your project written about or talked about through different media elements, through reviews, lists of shows surrounding certain topics, features, interviews, etc. Trying to get your show in front of your audience that exists elsewhere through email, newsletter, website, social, etc. Maybe you have like a live event space attached to your show. Maybe you have like an app. Then there's cross-promotional opportunities with other podcasts, because the best way to find podcast listeners is to go after the folks who are already listening to podcasts. There's no barrier to entry there.
Yes, we talk about this all the time at Podbean. Podcast listeners are listening to other people's podcasts. Do swaps, do ad swaps, do collaborations. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
It's a really accessible way for a lot of people to jump in and tackle this initiative as well. There's a lot of people who are looking to do it, and there's different levels of sophistication when it comes to like running this kind of outreach. But ultimately, like everybody is interested, especially if it's a good audience and content fit. And there's a lot of different ways that you can help track like the success of that. We use Chartable Smart Promos all the time, which basically uses pixel integrations to track how effective an ad unit is. There's a lot of different ways to think about that. And then there's paid acquisition, which I can go into. And then there's pitching podcast apps, which is a little bit more of like a gatekeeper situation, but not always, and opens up a lot of opportunity in the same way that people who are listening to other podcasts are like already kind of attuned to how to listen to a new podcast. The folks who are looking in the podcast app's discover section are the ones who are actively seeking out their next listen.
Absolutely. And at Podbean, we do have in-app promos. So I'll have the link here for everyone listening, which is pretty exciting. And in terms of some of that promo, can you tell us maybe an example of some shows that listeners may have heard of, or some particular launches that you guys can share with our listeners here at Podcasting Smarter?
Yeah, sure. So as Jeff mentioned, we have the pleasure of working with a wide range of clients of campaigns and shows. So that means genres. So we have some shows in the business category. You may have heard of Money Rehab with Nicole Lappin. Nicole is one of the best financial analysts and reporters out there, coming from CNBC and Bloomberg and CNN. And her podcast, Money Rehab, has basically been the number one show on the business charts for quite some time.
Yeah.
But more than that, we have other shows outside of business that we work with, some that folks may be familiar with, especially in the year 2022. One of the shows we had the pleasure to work on this past year was This Is Dating, which was a podcast that Vulture named one of the best of 2022, a co-production or This Is Dating was produced by Magnificent Noise, a collaboration of PRX. And basically I would call it a reality dating show, but through like a public radio-like lens. But again, our shows vary depending on the season, depending on the client we're working with. One of the more recent ones we've worked on is PBS Nature's podcast, Going Wild, with Dr. Raywyn Grant. It's a sound-rich, really beautiful journey, not just about the environment and, your favorite critters in the wilderness, but also identity and the sense of identity that comes from saving the wilderness and the world.
To tack onto that, we have the pleasure of working with a lot of really amazing partners. NPR new NPR stations, including NHPR, which is New Hampshire Public Radio, but then also, academic institutions, think tanks, other production companies, publishers, etc. So there's a lot of different ways in which we do that. We do use, I keep going back to the PR marketing, cross promo, app pitching, and paid acquisition, because that's the general framework in which we kind of tackle this. It always helps you can take a step back and just point to each of them and see kind of how we've been performing on them and what we need to go back to do more of. But generally speaking, there's 100 different ways to go about a marketing campaign or a growth campaign. And it really does go back to what are your goals and what's the best way to kind of connect the dots there.
Yeah, absolutely. And every podcast, like you mentioned, does have different goals, right? Maybe it's lead generation for your own small business. Maybe it's a hobby podcast. Maybe, you're trying to build a vast and wide audience, within your genre. So it really is specific to your podcast and the vision that you have for your show. I want to talk a little bit next about what the relationship is between audience and monetization, because you guys do move around in that space, especially with ad campaigns. And then also, there's budget put into building the show and then there's budget put into advertising on the show. So tell us a little bit about that push and pull in terms of audience and monetization with some of the shows that you work with. Yeah,
absolutely. So there's a lot of different ways that you can think about this. If you're trying to monetize a show via advertising, there's the math problem of how many downloads are you getting? How many impressions are attached to that download? For example, if you have a show that has 100,000 downloads an episode, you might have 100,000 pre-roll impressions, but then you might have, 80,000 impressions in your first mid-roll, 70,000 in your second, and 50,000 in your post-roll or something, which has to do with the consumption rate of the episodes. So there's actually some not complicated, but annoying math that goes into figuring this out to see really what you're able to sell for every show. And a lot of it is projection based. Some of it, is a little bit more regular if you're working with a show that's kind of always on. So you have more of an expectation of the audience. And then simultaneous to that, you have to look at what kind of growth opportunities exist as you're putting promotional efforts behind the show. So you can determine if I'm going to do this big campaign and we think that the New York Times is going to write about the show, is that going to impact these ad sales? And then you have to figure out the timing of that, because oftentimes you're actually selling these ads, months and months in advance. So anyway, I say all of this not as any form of guidance or education really, but more so just to illustrate that it can get really complicated when you're going out to monetize a show. So there's a bunch of different ways to think about it. The easiest and most regularly recurring on most shows is ad sales. And you basically just take your downloads versus your number of ad markers that are in each episode, and you try and sell those for a CPM, which is a cost per 1,000 downloads. And then you can say, if I'm going to get a $25 CPM for a pre-roll and we have 100,000 downloads, then that's 25,000 downloads for that pre-roll ad spot for that episode or that window of time or whatever it is. You can bake these in, you can do dynamic insertion. There's a few different methods in terms of how you do that. And then there's the idea of like host read versus producer read. Are you using pixel tracking? Are you not? So there's like a lot of very easy questions, but like, it gets complicated when you put them all in the same bucket. And, there's the whole artistry of actually selling these things.
Whether you're going to an agency.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of nuance in terms of the technical side of ads. And we have a lot of information here on that at Podbean, including dynamic ad insertion and all that good stuff. So we'll have links for everybody in the show notes. But in terms of overall kind of monetizing your show, so Jeff, what's the relationship between audience and monetization in terms of, your aggregate audience, maybe the size of your audience or your specific niche and how you can monetize it?
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting approach that a lot of publishers take differently than what the Podglomerate has done historically. But we actually might be moving more into that avenue in the future. But you see a lot of these companies that like are verticalizing the content that they're putting out. It could be around like women's interest stuff. It could be around entertainment. It could be around education or literature or business or entrepreneurship. But you see like a bunch of shows that are surrounding the same topics. And the reason that people or that publishers are doing that is because like you can start to design your content a little bit. And I hate to say this because it sounds so like jaded, but you can start to design your content a little bit towards the advertisers that you're looking to reach or the ones that you've already worked with in the past and kind of like group those sales together in a few different ways. But generally speaking, like an advertiser is going to be looking for content that is going to both match like what they're selling. And then also you can look at it through like the demographics of who your audience is. So what I mean by that is like, if you have a podcast about entrepreneurship, then like QuickBooks might be interested in advertising on that because you have a bunch of theoretical entrepreneurs who are going to be like
needing to do their taxes, right?
Exactly.
Yeah,
but then at the same note, like
you can also look at like, who's listening to the show. Like, Dove Soap or Unilever may have like a bunch of data on like, men in their 30s in Ohio that they want to reach. And, you might have a comedy show that has nothing to do with soap or cleaning or whatever, or wellness. But like that might be their target demo based on what they're trying to hit. And there's 100 different ways that they can go about actually trying to find that audience programmatically and directly. So there's like really two major ways that advertisers will look at that, like contextual and then demographic.
Fantastic. And Jeff, just to ask a direct follow-up, at the Podglomerate, you guys are really known for your data-based approach that drives development. So you kind of spoke about it a little bit. How does the data that you guys are looking at drive the development of content and specific podcast shows?
So sometimes the cobbler's kid has the worst shoes. We really, when we're looking to develop shows, like we look at it from a few different angles. On the data side, like we know what we're able to sell really well. Currently, those two like buckets would be like anything in like the business, money, entrepreneurial side. And the second thing would be on like the wellness front. And we're looking at like past sales over the last year, 6 months, 3 months, whatever it is, and like what we've been able to do well and what's getting renewals. On the same note, like the content really has to stand up because it's easy to sell something for like a test. It's really hard to get a renewal if it's not working. But then when it comes to like the development, the cobbler's kid comment has to do with really the idea that like there's the stuff that we know is going to make us money on the ad sales front. And then there's the stuff that we just really love making. So we make a lot of shows about like the literary and publishing community. And we do that really because like, the team that we built really loves that content. And we know how to like grow it and just, we don't always know how to monetize it. So I guess there's a little bit of like a double-sided sword here or a double-edged blade because there is
that creative impetus to make that good content for the sake of good content. Absolutely. And Joni, I want to kind of direct this next question to you. What are some general best practices for building your podcast audience?
Oh gosh. And are you thinking more so for someone who's starting out with the idea of podcast marketing audience development, or maybe
I would say,
great.
We'll talk about launch in a little bit specifically for launch strategy, because I definitely here at Podcasting Smarter, we do talk about that a lot. But I also want to talk about, for anybody who's had a podcast out there and maybe, it's stagnant or you have a consistent audience, but it's a specific size and it's plateaued.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. And I'll start by saying the reason I asked that question to you, Norma Jean, is because it's also worth starting that internal question and ideation of what resources do I have available to me? Resources, not just in budget and paid budget that you could do on paid ad spend or paid audio spend, but also what is the internal and owned operational channels that you have that you could utilize in growing audience, in the sense of, do you have an email newsletter? Do you have social media channels that are active? Obviously, the podcast feed, if you're wanting to grow your audience, that's pre-existing. But I mention that because knowing that, doing that internal audit will be able to give you a sense of, okay, if I reach out to a cross-promotional partner, whether it's another podcast, maybe it's an email newsletter with an audience that I'd love to be able to get my podcast in front of. Here are the ways in which I can say how I can return the favor, how I can be able to build this cross-promotional relationship so it's beneficial to both sides. So that's the first thing I would do, is really just consider what do you have available and what are your audience and content goals. And then following that, it's then deciding and making a list of where are the places that you would love to have your show featured and put in front of that audience type, that target audience that you'd love to be able to bring on board. And again, that can include email newsletters and maybe can include social media channels. But to everyone's point on this, interview, audio really is the royalty in the cross-promotional universe of podcast marketing and audience development. It's great to really be able to consider where are people going for audio because they love audio and they know it and you can speak their language. So look to podcasts that fit the niche or a comparable niche of what you're doing. Reach out to their hosts, reach out to their producers, see if you can do a trade of some kind. Usually that's free.
Absolutely.
Usually that's an easy way to do it.
Absolutely. And, we talk about this, you don't always have to have budget and say like, hey, can I pay you to promote my podcast on your podcast? You don't always have to buy those ad slots. Sometimes, podcasting is about community and it's relational, right? It's about building that network and saying, hey, we're in the same genre. I love your show. I'd love to be featured on your show. Here's what I can do for you. And just building that bridge. So I think that that's a really important point. And I want to ask you next, Joni, what makes the difference for the podcasts that have made that impact or stand out in terms of audience development? Have you seen anything different in terms of practices that they're doing, anything consistent that they're doing that maybe podcasters here can learn from?
One thing I would say is that not everything with podcasting should be focused on the data, because to your point, it is about human relationships. It is about growing an audience, engaging with the community, growing relationships across the different, fields of audio and media. But yeah, it does come down to downloads. It does come down to the little, data figures 0 to 9 that can give you an indication of whether your efforts are actually falling upon the right ears and encouraging them to be converted into listeners and maybe subscribers or members, depending on what your goals are for your podcast down the line. So I would say that maybe one of the things that people are emphasizing more and more now that people understand how to make a podcast in terms of where to get equipment, where to get the best microphone. Now we're in the phase of this podcast industry of, okay, now what? How do we actually gauge the growth? And what do we need to know about the data in order to fuel our decisions moving forward? So for any podcaster out there that's listening, I would say it's, yes, ideating, thinking of the big ways that you can market and put your podcast in front of people, but it's also rooting that to some degree, in the data. So that means what platform are you using to host and distribute your show? And are they giving you enough data for you to be able to see the, growth effect, the rate in which you are actually able to expand your podcast empire? So that's something to consider.
Absolutely. Yes, we talk about this all the time at Podbean because we're very big at statistics. But, sometimes, it's important to know what you're getting with a host. And when you're picking a host, there's a few things to think about. Statistics is a really big one. Whether ad platforms and ad integration is built in is another one. So definitely picking a host is super important. And I want to talk now about launch, because we did kind of touch on this earlier. So I kind of want to ask you both this question because I feel like I might get slightly different answers. So how important is a show launch or a season launch versus ongoing strategy growth? Because I always feel like when people are doing a launch or even a new season of their show or a new series is coming out, there's this big push and there's a bit of momentum around it. So number one, how important is that? What can podcasters do to create that? And then also, what are some strategies for ongoing growth in terms of sustaining that kind of excitement?
Well, being able to have a strong marketing plan, it it means being able to know in advance when your launch is going to occur or when your new series or new episodes is going to occur. The more time you have, the more, ramp or road you have ahead of you, it's going to make it an easier way but hopefully an easier way for you to be able to accomplish your goals. So internally, at the Podglomerate, we're wanting to get as much time as possible. Now, sometimes that doesn't end up that way. Maybe it's that we have a few weeks notice, but I would say for anyone listening out there, try to have at least a month, maybe even 2 or 3, so that okay, this is how much time I have to be able to start those conversations for app features, for media coverage and publicity, for cross-promotional swaps. We know how busy podcasters are out there, and the more time you give them to get on their calendar for production, for recording, for scripts exchanges, that's going to make it easier on you to have that line up perfectly to the week and the month that you're going to be launching your new podcast or your new episode. And that's key, is that first month really is the best time to be able to get the most eyeballs on that piece of work, to be able to encourage that growth even further. Now, if it doesn't work out that way, it's not the end of the world by any means. But I'd also say too, how is your strategy incorporating not just that launch month, that launch week or launch day, but also maybe the series run or the first few months of the series or episodes? So that's something to consider. It's not a full app marathon where everything has to fall on the first day of that launch or the first week or month. So stretch it out. If you need to expand it out so that it's more of a, sprint or a walk, so that way you can pace yourself, then definitely go for that as well.
Yes, absolutely. I think sustainability is a really important aspect of it as well. And I love what you said in terms of preparation, because we talk about this a lot as well in terms of producing your show. Make sure you have a bank of episodes when you launch, right? Make sure you have a production plan, because pod fade is real.
Yeah.
And
I'll add to that, I think that's a perfect way to think of it, is that, everyone when creating a podcast, you're thinking, oh, how much time is it going to be for me to make this show and make it sound rich, to make the episodes pop, to make it, a great accompaniment for a podcast listener out there, whatever they're doing. I'd say the same time should be spent as well in tandem, thinking of that podcast marketing strategy. As you're visualizing what your sound is going to be, the scripts, think the other side of the coin. Think about, what is the marketing efforts going to be for this particular episode? Are there sound bites we can take out from it, make into, quotable cards for social media purposes? Are there video segments that we can utilize that for TikTok or Instagram Reels or something else? It's thinking of it from both lenses. I know that can be a bit of a muscle strain at times, but that's going to be helpful, because as you're ideating on the production side, you're also going to be brainstorming then, how can this be something to grow that audience out further?
Yes, absolutely. Jeff, do you want to add in here?
Yeah, I think that there's a few different ways to look at this. First of all, I agree with everything that both of you just said, but really diving into it a little bit, I think that there's a different structure for marketing an always on show versus seasonal show versus some kind of fictional show versus any other type of genre that's out there. For example, I think just given the nature, and this is a funny way to put this, but given the nature of how podcast apps work, if you get a bunch of subscribers from day one, then you're typically going to have people who are going to benefit from all of the pull mechanics that are built into that system throughout the rest of the season. So for example, if I get somebody on Apple Podcasts to hit subscribe on the show, then for at least the next month, they're going to get a push notification from Apple every time I publish a new episode, which can be really powerful, because it's people in some cases aren't sitting there thinking about when the next episode of a show is going to come out. So there's a lot of ways that you can implement your strategy to utilize the tools of other systems. And I think about that quite a bit, because there's a bunch of different ways in which you can kind of pull those levers. On the same note, if this is a seasonal or an anthology show or something, oftentimes the creator has built that show with the idea of, serial, not seasonal. Oftentimes the creator has built that show with the idea of people listening to episode 1 and then moving forward through the rest of the series.
Just binging.
So if it's a true crime.
You mean they're just going to I'm going to find this show. I'm going to binge this show. This show is my personality now.
Well, it's not even necessarily binging. It can be binging, yes. But it's also somebody's going to start on episode 1. And that might not apply for something that's an always on conversational talking heads show.
Right. It's not episodic.
Exactly. Yeah. So you want to make sure that you're driving a lot of your traffic back to that first episode for a show that is a serial or episodic. And you can kind of see a lot of trends in the data when you like really dive in. You can see, for example, that first episode consumption rate might be like 50%. So half of everybody that comes to listen to it are going to jump off. But then like on episode 2, anybody who's made it past that threshold, you're going to see like 80% of people are going to listen through episode 2. And then for episode 3, it might be 90% of people. And you can use all of that like towards some of your marketing strategy in terms of like how you're like funneling your listeners to certain platforms or landing pages or episodes of the show. Whereas if this is like an always on show with talking heads or something, you might do an entire campaign surrounding like one big guest or one big like event. And like you can then like build your funnel to get people into that one episode. And then within the production of that episode, you can kind of let them know like, hey, if you like this episode, you might also like this one that we did. And like start to build in like your marketing plan and that funnel to like get people to listen to other episodes of the show. So kind of like cross promoting within your own show. If
where you know your listeners are going to be. Absolutely.
Exactly.
Oh, that's brilliant.
If that's your entry point.
Yeah.
Exactly. So it's figuring out where the entry point of your show is and then making the most of that. Absolutely.
Yeah. And then there's also a lot of ways that you can like just use the data to influence like how you're making these decisions. But to Joni's point, like you shouldn't be using that as the only frame of reference. That should just be like one tool in your tool set.
Yeah. And I think that's a key point here is that there are a wide array of strategies and tactics that, again, can fit your budget, your resource, your time management, because, again, pod burnout's real or pod fade is real. So consider trying new things, trying a few different things, looking at the data, seeing what's sticky, and then move forward with that a little bit more. This is an experiment, right? There's no one true path, the absolute path that is always going to work every single time. So diversify. Try new things, make new relationships, and figure out what works for you in this particular scenario for your podcast.
Absolutely. And you guys work with some, established names and much bigger budgets, but you don't have to have a huge budget. Like we mentioned, you can start out, approaching other podcasts within your genre that you love and just, ask to collaborate. You can do these things for free with your time. So it's definitely something where audience growth is achievable for every podcast of every size. It really is something that is accessible to all podcasters. So it's really important to remember that as we're talking, because some of the shows you guys talk about, they're incredible, but not every podcaster has that kind of budget.
I'd say 90% of the stuff that we do, and yes, there's like infrastructure and staff and like a lot of costs that are associated with this, but I'd say 90% of what we do is not paid. So it's Joni has a really good kind of line that she goes back to often about how the work that we do is basically just relationship building. And I think that is so true and so important. And, really it's all about just like building these connections, not for like an ask that you have today or when your show launches, but like to start building community so that when you have something in the future that you want to get in front of the right people, like you already have that relationship.
It's true.
Absolutely.
And especially in this media landscape, I've been working in it now for 11 years. The friends that I made back when I started in media, basically in college, are people I'm still in touch with today. They may have different roles. They may be at different organizations, but the landscape is such where more times than not, if you meet someone today and just have a great relationship now, that could be something that builds into something more wherever they are, wherever you are in the future. So again, make friends. Podcasting is friendship in so many different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think community plays such a big role in, not only the success of, personally our careers, but in podcasting, community is really so prevalent in terms of, it really is a small community. When you go to an in-person conference, you're meeting people and it really is, something where people feel that relational aspect and it's about building those bridges. So fantastic. It has been such a pleasure to have you both here today. I always ask our guests a couple more questions. So I'm going to ask you both, where do you believe the industry is headed?
I think that we're still in like the second or third inning of where the industry is going to go. And what I say there, it's funny. I go back to this pretty often, but Mark Andreessen, like a decade ago, had this comment or a blog that he wrote about 8 different ways that media companies can monetize. It includes, micropayments, advertising, subscriptions, events, premium content, etc. It's actually been updated recently to 10. You can Google that. It's all out there. It's like, Mark Andreessen's 8 forms of revenue or something.
Yeah, we'll have it here in the show notes.
Perfect. But I go back to that as kind of a blueprint because podcasting is basically every other form of media in its infancy. We still have problems every day. Like, we're hearing now about people buying fake downloads or like, what's the difference between a stream and a download, or how do pass-through analytics work, or, what is a pixel? And like, we're still very much in the education phase. There's a lot of really basic stuff that people don't necessarily know or aren't necessarily aware of from day one. And so I think this is a medium that has proven to be really effective and efficient at finding an audience and, kind of bypassing the gatekeepers to an extent. Although I'm sure that one day we'll have these gatekeepers back. But I guess the long-winded way of what I'm about to say is, like, I think that we're still really early. And everybody who's talking about how there's like too many publishers or production houses or marketers or, advertisers, like, I really think that you got to take a step back and look at every other industry. We're still like a fraction of the size of any other form of media. And I think that there's plenty of opportunity and ability for everyone to like really scale pretty significantly. And I think, we're still going to be having this conversation 20 years from now.
Absolutely. Yeah. Joni, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think to that point, we're thinking of scaling, not we as in the Podglomerate, but just we as in the podcast industry. The scale is happening not just in the sense of, how we're looking at publishers growing in the space or joining us, but also the scale to which we're growing audiences through the language of the podcast. English is still predominant as the language for podcasting, but looking to growing in different languages. So that means that new apps are going to be forming to be able to accommodate for that and grow those and amplify those voices and stories further. So looking at, a company like Wondery, where they are translating their content and pre-existing content that's chart-topping content into different languages is a brilliant move. It's something that we should really consider too, as we look into transcriptions and subtitles or captionings, just to be able to accommodate for all audiences and have them join podcasting in whatever way they'd like. But also, I would just say too, the future of podcasting is not to be a cop-out here, but it's the future of audience growth and podcast marketing. The last decade, I feel like is really focused on how to produce a podcast, how to be a podcaster, a host in that own right. And I think we're now in the next era, if you will, of podcasting, where it is diving in deeper to say, now that we know how to make this content, how can we grow it? And how can we decide how to grow it the best way possible? So that means understanding ad tech, being able to really dive into the numbers more for anyone, regardless of their mathematics background. And also, again, understanding how to be able to really create content with purpose and design thinking being at the heart of that, rather than just shouting into the wilderness and expecting someone to come to you. So those are the things I'm thinking about as we get into the new year and the new, if you will, decade of podcasting.
Absolutely. Well, Jeff Umbro, CEO and founder, and Joni Deutch, Vice President of Marketing and Audience Development of the Podglomerate. Thank you both so much for joining us. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Podcasting Smarter. If you have any podcasting questions or want to get in touch, send us an email at podcastingsmarter@podbean.com. Thanks so much and happy podcasting.